Over the last 100 years, electric trains have changed in nearly every aspect, from what motors are going to be used, to how powerful they've become, and how they've impacted the world around them. My name is Jamie, and I'm here to tell you about how they evolved and changed over time. Some of the famous of these engines would be the famed Pennsylvania Railroad GG1, the New Haven EP5, or the modern-day Siemens ACS 64. The focus of this series is on five specific railroads: the Pennsylvania Railroad, New Haven, the New York Central, Amtrak, and Central. In today's episode, we focus on New York Central's effort to electrify and the locomotives they use to do so. If you are interested in further histories of electric locomotives, do subscribe to my YouTube channel, as I will be doing further episodes of these weekly. While we don't start at the very genesis of electric locomotives, we do start at how these railroads were forced into using electric locomotives. As a phrase I'd be told many times through the railways would be the phrase, "rules are written in blood." In January 8, 1902, a horrific accident occurred, where a locomotive engineer at 8:20 a.m. at Park Avenue Tunnels committed a SPAD, or an SSAO. In regular terms, he went past a signal set at stop. This resulted in the train colliding with another southbound train, killing 15 and injuring 30. John Wisco, the engineer who survived, recounted being unable to sight the signals and was under the pressure of trying to make up time. Sadly, a common phrase uttered after incidents. The aftermath was that the engineer was deemed not responsible for the accident, and the blame was to be put on New York Central. While there were plans to electrify the section in 1899, there was no funding given or consideration. A week after the incident, New York Central President William H. Newman announced that all suburban lines leading into the previous Grand Central Depot would be electrified. Contributing to the pressure was the state of New York banning steam locomotives traveling into Manhattan starting on July 1st, 1908. This also resulted in Grand Central Terminal being drafted to replace the old Grand Central Depot. Before we get any further into locomotives, we need to talk about the whole iconic new station to replace the old. Grand Central Station wasn't just any station, but it was a whole project, designed by architects Charles Reed and Alan Stem, intending to compete with Pennsylvania's railroad's Penn Station in status. Despite the name Grand Central, the New Haven Railroad would also be funding a third of the cost of construction. Grand Central Station would also include a new power station to help power the new electric trains, a new building for the headquarters for the New York Central. Originally, also included in the plan for Grand Central was an office building to be placed on top, hoping that the rents would offset the cost of running the station. On opening day, the train shed would have 123 tracks, which also included duplicate track numbers, storage tracks, with a combined length of 19.5 miles. The station itself would have 28 platforms and 44 platform numbers. In 1913, it was believed that the station would be able to process 100 million passengers per year. One factor we don't consider is amenities when it comes to stations. From experience, we don't appreciate them until they're not there. Well, the designers thought about this and included many different types of amenities. This included waiting rooms for women travelers, shoeshine rooms, telephone rooms, in 1913, mind you, a beauty salon for both men and women, a dressing room, and one of the most iconic restaurants of New York, the Oyster Bar. While electric trains weren't new in New York, as third rail had been present for over a decade by this point, New York Central would choose third rail over overhead lines. Like everything in life, there are multiple versions of this. The New York Central would pick underrunning compared to top running. Top running is when the contact chute touches the top of the rail. The advantages of top rail running is that, well, it's cheaper to construct. Under rail running means that the contact shoe is in contact with the bottom of the rails. This means that the third rail is not only lifted off the ground, but also protected from the elements. It also has the advantage of being much safer for people on track, where it becomes much harder to touch the railhead and be electrocuted. Even to this day, one common issue with third rail running is when ice or snow covers the top rail, preventing electrical contact. Another issue is how fatalities or severe injuries can happen when somebody accidentally touches the third rail while trying to climb back on the platform. In New York, the subway and the Long Island Railroad still uses top running, while the New York Central used and later and developed underrunning third rail since 1906. The New York Central would choose this third rail option because it was unable to fit overhead lines due to clearance issues in tunnels. This resulted in a new need for new electric locomotives. Approaching General Electric and Alco, as they had been successful in electrifying the Baltimore Beltline in the 1890s. In 1904, they came up with something called the S-motor. This truly impressed New York Central with its impressive power and package size. Like many electric locomotives from the early years, it was equipped with bipolar motors. A common household equivalent would be the brushed DC motor with a commutator. Think early model train motors, especially the ones that you'd see maybe some of the early Lima or Atlas models from the early 70s or something like that. At half the length of a conventional engine with a tender, while weighing 2/3 as much, while having more power. For comparison, these nearly had as much tractive effort as a regular 460 locomotive. A feature rarely talked about electrics is the simplicity of changing ends. Instead of requiring a simple turntable to reverse it, all it needed was a simple switch. Originally delivered in 1907, unfortunately as usual, there was a horrible accident. A train led by two S2 motors, 3407 and 3421, derailed on a curve on the Harlem line, killing 24 and injuring 140. The S motors had a flaw of having a long wheelbase. This led to the class being modified to have two axle trucks on the leading and trailing end, to help guide the locomotive into curves. In 1908, when 12 more S motors were ordered under the S3 designation to assist in further electrification to North White Plains on the Harlem lines. These were quickly replaced from mainline duties when their replacement, the T motors, arrived on the scene in 1913. They would still serve on shorter commuter trains and switching duties. This was due to because the weight was being spread onto unpowered axles, and this would cause it to struggle on longer and heavier trains. Despite this, they would survive for quite a long time. They would survive into Penn Central era where their commuter trains would finally be taken over by New Haven's FL9s, third rail capable diesel locomotives. Their final duty would be the underground yard of Grand Central Terminal, and the last S-motor would be struck off the register in 1981 by Conrail after 75 years of service. This leads us to the T-motor, an overall improvement over the previous S-motors. They would have 4 powered 2-axle trucks. This meant close to 71,000 pounds of tractive effort on the T3 models, more than even in New York Central Niagara, while having a top speed of 75 miles per hour, which was a very respectable top speed. The first being built in 1913 and would slowly be delivered with the war going on, and with the final T3 being delivered in 1926. Due to the power and versatility of the T-motors, it allowed them to work on most services, from the regular commuter trains to the iconic 20th Century Limited. A big improvement over the previous S-motors was that because all trucks were powered, it would allow them to accelerate even quicker and be able to pull larger trains without having wheel slip. They would be the mainstay of the New York Central electric passenger fleet until the 1950s, where the replacements such as the P2s would be arriving on the scene. The next locomotive, which would be a further evolution of the T motor, called the R motor. However, before we go on to that, we need to explain how certain societal pressures caused the R motor to appear on the scene. This meant explaining the Kaufman Act of 1923. The Kaufman Electrification Act of 1923 would pressure change in the city of New York. The act required by January 1st, 1926, all rail traffic in New York City, Mount Vernon, and Yonkers must be converted to electric traction. No exclusions were permitted. This meant from tiny switcher to mainline locomotive must be converted to electric traction. In December 31st, 1925, 8 railroads would secure an injunction against the penalties. They argued the $5,000 fine would paralyze the city in terms of fining the New York Central almost $600,000 a day. In 1926, they would initiate a lawsuit that the penalties were unconstitutional. In 1926, due to it being deemed unconstitutional due to infringing the right for the Commerce Clause. It had to be amended, and it was extended by another 5 years, and it allowed the usage of diesels and electrics. Later on, the mayor and railroad executives agreed to remove surface tracks from the west side, and by 1929 would be ceased north of 72nd Street by 1931, and removal of all tracks south of 60th Street by 1934. The R motor was developed due to this elimination of street running along 10th Avenue and due to the ban of steam locomotives. The R motor was developed as a freight locomotive and to be a prototype for the future P and R2 motors that will be covered in a later video. The prototype R-Class was 2 semi-permanent coupled units that are 4 2-axle powered trucks that use GE's DC traction motors. With its motors, its top speed would be a decent 60 miles per hour and with 4,000 horsepower to drag these trains along. It was mainly used to be a freight locomotive to allow for freight being moved along New York City due to the ban of steam locomotives, and at this time, even the idea of diesels were not permitted. And not only that, diesel traction hadn't really taken off by this time. The earliest real diesel road switches would only really come into the later 30s, so it's around 15 years too early, I suppose. Its total length was 68 feet, as it had to work the tight curves with a new west side elevated line. However, this R motor prototype the final fate was to be converted into a pair of diesel hump trailers in 1945. That's all we will cover for today on how the mighty New York Central developed its electrics and how Grand Central Station was born out of a tragedy. For next week's episode, we will be covering second-generation electrics from the Pennsylvania Railroad, where I will be talking about, in my solid opinion, the greatest electric locomotive of all time, the GG1. I think we all can agree is if you haven't figured out a way to improve within the 50 years that the GG1 was operating to make it better, or, just overall either improve it, refurbish it, you got to agree for 50 years. I think they were onto something really good there. However, I will also be talking about the other locomotives. Some of them are some of my personal favorites, such as the P5s, the prototype for the GG1, the R1, and the O1s. Some of these you might not have heard of before. We will also be covering in the future New Haven's electrics effort and its first efforts with the box cab locomotive. I believe that's something that we never actually really hear about. Generally speaking, a lot of people sort of glaze over and talk about how amazing Pennsylvania Railroad's electric efforts are, but we all sort of skip over New Haven, which I find very interesting because the New Haven Railroad had some really beautiful locomotives such as the EP4s and even some of the earlier EF3s, and I think even the box cabs in my opinion. However, I'd just like to say thank you to my subscribers and my partner for supporting, and I would like to say thank you. Thank you just for listening, and just being able to enjoy this content. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you subscribe for the following episode about Pennsylvania Railroad's second generation of locomotives. Thank you, and hopefully you had a good time watching this, but overall, have a good day.